sometimes on social media, you get those posts where people put up two photos with two captions. How things began, how things ended. You seen them? And it can be a proper powerful thing, capturing the beginning of something and the ending of something. So you could have a childhood photo with a little kid, big, beautiful eyes, full of innocence. Capture that same soul years later. You've got eyes now heavy, betraying that that innocence has been stolen. How things began, how things end. Maybe you've got a photo of you and your spouse in the early days of dating, all the excitement of that stage. And you then capture a photo now where the marriage hangs by a string. How things began, how things end. Maybe a photo of you back in the day when you were stone cold sober. Maybe a photo now after years of addiction. Maybe actually it could just be a photo of you full of joy on the day of your baptism. And now a photo of you where you know you're hiding a double life and you feel spiritually stale. And sometimes how things began can be the thing that add to the agony of where things have ended. Now, that's very true of the Samson story. This is week 3 of looking at this lad, Samson. Do you remember how his story began? Chapter 13 of Judges was the how things began moment. And if Samson's mum could have had a 12-week scan of her baby in the womb, she's looking at a photo full of the promises of God, that he's going to be devoted to God and the deliverer of God's people. It started so strong, didn't it? But as we watched last week, we saw Samson's life becoming more and more diluted in its devotion to God. And Samson as a deliverer becoming more and more defiled by everything that he has done. And this week, chapter 16, is the how things ended photo. Let me describe the photo to you. This is Judges chapter 16, verse 21. This is the how things ended moment. The Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. I want to give that photo this caption. The donkey maker is made a donkey. That picture of him grinding grain in a prison is a donkey's job. Here's the caption. The donkey maker has been made a donkey. The reason I say that is, last week at the end of chapter 15, Samson did something mental. He killed 1,000 men just with the jawbone of a donkey. That's some feat. And after he's done this, he sings a little song of celebration. Here's the lyrics. With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. That's got the kind of feel of a football terrace taunt. I have made donkeys of them. That's the song. He's a donkey maker. Sometimes how things start add to the agony of where things end. Here he is taunting his enemies that he's made donkeys of them. But how do things end? His enemies have made a donkey of him. He is blind, bound, grinding out the grain like a donkey in a prison. One of the favorite books in our house is Wonky Donkey. Anyone read that book? He's a cranky, stinky, dinky, lanky, honky, tonky, winky, wonky, donkey. But that's the picture. And it's tragic. The donkey maker is made a donkey. And you're left asking, How's the strong man landed here? Chapter 16 continues to fill in the gaps between those start and end photos. And as we work through chapter 16, I want to show us three things that come up again and again and again that has turned this deliverer into a donkey. Here's the three things: arrogance, adultery, assumptions. And we're going to see those cycle. Arrogance, adultery, assumption. Look at verse 1 of chapter 16. One day, Samson went to Gaza. Now, that already smells of arrogance, because that is the capital city of the enemy Philistines. So Samson walking into Gaza is like a lamb walking into a butcher's shop. This is dangerous territory, deep into dangerous territory. But there's this kind of like untouchable swagger to Samson. He's arrogant. There's a phrase that's quite common in AA. Some of you know the end of it. If you sit in a barber's shop for long enough, sooner or later, you're going to get a haircut. That's actually a very ominous saying for a Nazarite like Samson who's got very long hair. Sit in a barber shop long enough, you're going to get a haircut. Play around in Gaza long enough, there'll be consequences. But he's got this untouchable swagger. So carry on, verse 1. He's in Gaza where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. Again, if you've been with us in Judges, you'll know that all the way through the book, prostitution has been the picture of sin. But here's Samson not just picturing adultery, but practicing adultery. He's meant to be a man devoted to the Lord. Instead, he is devoted to lust. Enters the city, sees a prostitute, sleeps with a prostitute. We know where this ends. Look at verse 2. The people of Gaza were told, Samson's here. So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, at dawn we'll kill him. But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. Then he got up, took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the posts, tore them loose, bar and all, and lifted them to his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. So Samson's demonstrated his sin, but now he demonstrates his strength. He takes the city gates on a wee walk. Not actually so wee. 40 miles uphill. Mad, isn't it? But again, the smell is arrogance. This is not a selfless act that saves others. It's a kind of a self-admiring act that shows off. And it's like saying, when you have a demonstration of your sin, but follow that with a demonstration of your strength, that can lead to some significant assumptions. If I can get away with adultery once, I can probably get away with adultery again. The thought in his head, presumably, is my strength will keep me safe, even in my sin. But we know how that ends. And even for us, sometimes getting away with something once is the worst thing that can happen to us. Do you see those three things? Arrogance, adultery, assumptions. Let's keep reading because the cycles keep cycling. Look at verse 4. Sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. So another woman, another Philistine. More arrogance, more adultery, more assumptions. We know where this ends. Verse 5. The ruler of the Philistines went and said to Delilah, see if you can lure Samson into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him, so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. Now, do you see how deep of danger Samson's now in? He's fallen head over heels into love with a lassie who is motivated by shed loads of silver to stab him in the back. This is a compromised couple. This is an unequal yoke. A Philistine and an Israelite. A believer and an unbeliever. But the arrogance that has fueled his adultery aid and abets his assumptions. My strength will keep me safe even in this sin. We know where this is going to end. Okay, verse 6. So, motivated by the cash, Delilah said to Samson, tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued. This is pillow talk. Verse 7, Samson answered her, if anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man. That's bull, by the way. He's just making stuff up. He's playing a game. Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. With men hidden in the room, she called to him, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Do you see how toxic this relationship is? She is playing the traitor. He is outright lying. And all of this is out in the open. And you think, if you're Samson, you go, right, this is the time to get out. However, verse 10, Delilah said to Samson, you've made a fool of me. You lied to me. You've been lying to him, hen. You're both at it. Come now, tell me how you can be tied. He said, if anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man. And you think, Samson, what are you playing at? Get out. You know that she's out to get you. She's already called the Philistines into the bedroom once. She's out to get you. But presumably, he's preoccupied with getting his leg over her. And so he plays the game. Verse 12, so Delilah took new ropes, tied him with them. Then the men hidden in the room, she called to him, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. But he snapped the ropes with his arms as if they were threads. Take 2, same outcome. The only difference is now, he can absolutely assume that she is out to assassinate him. Verse 13, Delilah then said to Samson, all this time you've been making a fool of me and lying to me. He could equally say, all this time you've been trying to kill me. Tell me how you can be tied, he replied. If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric of the loom and tighten it with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man. Flip me, he must have been a deep sleeper, eh? So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened them with a pin. Again, she called to him, Samson, Philistines are on you. He awoke from his sleep and pulled the pin out of the loom with the fabric. Then she said to him, how can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is not love. Very quick application. If someone says I love you, but they're doing this to you, it is not love. She's in it for the cash. He's in it for the sex. That is not love. She says, this is the 3rd time you made a fool out of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength. With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. Listen to this phrase. So he told her everything. No razor's ever been used on my head, he said, because I've been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. He should have been anyway. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. Isn't it amazing to hear him say, I have been dedicated to God? No, you've not. It's interesting, the name Delilah in the original language sounds very similar, apparently, to the word for night. And Samson, as someone dedicated to the Lord, ought to have shone like a star against this woman of the night. But instead, his dedication to the Lord has become so diluted and defiled that he has become as dull and dark as her name sounds. Verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more, he's told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. She's hit the jackpot. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, "Samson, Philistines are upon you." He woke up from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." That's the assumption. Listen to this. But he did not know the Lord had left him. He did not know the Lord had left him. He assumed the Lord never would. He assumed despite his arrogance and despite all of his adultery, the Lord would never leave him. Samson assumed wrong. Arrogance, adultery, assumption, abandoned. So then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, took him down to Gaza, binding him with bronze shackles. They set him to grinding grain in the prison. The donkey maker is made a donkey. The point is very simple. Continued compromise has consequences. Now, the people who would have read this book for the first time were actually in very similar circumstances to Samson because of very similar compromises as Samson. They were shackled in exile. And it's as if the book is written for them to say, listen, do you see, despite where you started, why things have ended for you where they have ended? Arrogance, adultery, assumptions, abandoned. And so the picture of Samson, bound and blind as a donkey, is meant to help us detect those moments where we have thought what we shouldn't have, arrogantly. Gone where we shouldn't have, arrogantly. Done what we shouldn't have, adulterously. Presumed what we shouldn't have, assumptively. Is that a word? But it's meant to say, listen, if you sit in a barbershop long enough, sooner or later you're going to get a haircut. If you continue walking in arrogance and adultery and assumption, sooner or later the Lord is going to abandon you. If you keep on turning off your light so that you fit in with the darkness of the people around you in our community or in your workplace or in your family, sooner or later the Lord will just disconnect you from his power source. Abandoned. And the lesson is, if we don't check ourselves by this and correct ourselves by this, we know where this story ends. Slavery, shame, suffering. Like a donkey. And that could legit be where things end. But, and this would make a cracking cliffhanger at the end of like a Netflix episode. You know that moment you go, ah! Let's see what next. Samson's fast asleep in the prison, and the camera zooms in on his bald head. And look at what verse 22 says. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Ooh. Hair sprouts hope. This is not why I've been growing my hair for the last year. Not just for this sermon. But that's the point, isn't it? It seems like this is where things will end. But his hair began to grow again. So, we're going to see the next scene, the next photo. We said the first one was, the donkey maker has been made a donkey. Here's the caption for the second one. But the Lord can defeat Dagon with a donkey. That's the second caption. The donkey maker has been made a donkey, but the Lord can defeat Dagon, the idol, with a donkey. Have a look at verse 23. Now, the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." See, they think this is something that Dagon has done. We know this is actually someone that the Lord has abandoned. Verse 24, when the people saw Samson, they praised their god Dagon, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste to our land and multiplied our slain." While they were in high spirits, i.e. drunk, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. Now, there are stunning similarities here between what happens to Samson and what happens to Jesus 1,000 years later. Both Samson and Jesus are handed over for silver, Delilah and Judas. Both of them are handed over into foreign hands, Philistines, Romans. Both of them are bound and tortured. And both of them are brought out into public display to be humiliated for the entertainment of their captors. Here's Samson, a bound, blind donkey made to perform. When Jesus was first captured, before his trial, the men who were guarding him blindfold him, as blind as Samson. And they stand in a circle around him, and one of them hits him, and they shout tauntingly, "Ha ha, prophesy, who hit you?" Here are Samson and Jesus with striking similarities. But there are definite differences. Samson is here because of his arrogance. Jesus is here because of his humility. Samson is here because of his adulterous sin. Jesus is here because of my adulterous sin. Unlike Samson, Jesus never shows off his strength in self-serving displays. Instead, Jesus takes on our shame as our servant deliverer. Keeping on the donkey theme, think of it this way. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, he didn't gallop in on a white stallion in a parade of honor. Do you know how he came in? He ambled in on a little donkey in a presentation of humiliation. Here is Jesus saying, the donkey-like suffering and shame and slavery that ought to be your burden forever, I will bear. We're going to sing soon. Bearing shame and scoffing rude, in my place, condemned he stood. And if you've got to a point in your life where the photo is unbearable shame, you need to stare at this photo of Jesus who came to bear your shame. If you're there going, I am under unbearable shame, you need to put your faith in the one who has come to bear that shame for you, away from you. It's the humiliation of Jesus that are the sprouts of our hope. Now, look at verse 25, because this is where the Lord begins to defeat Dagon with a donkey. Halfway through verse 25, they stood Samson among the pillars of this temple. Samson said to the servant who held his hand, isn't that just an amazing thing? He was the strongest man in the land. Now he has to be led by his hand. Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple so I can lean against him. Now, the temple was crowded with men and women All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Humiliation. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on one, his left hand on the other. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Now the photo here of Samson is still pretty pathetic. A blind, bound donkey needing to be led by a servant. But actually, in his weakness, he's stronger than he's ever been. Though blind, he sees. Thus far in his story, everything has been defined by his fleshly lust in his eyes. But now blind, he sees, and he seems to be full of faith in God. Though blind, he sees. Though powerless, he prays. So far, he seems to have assumed that his strength comes from his hair, but now he seems to get the hair's only the headline, and actually his strength comes from the sovereign Lord. And so powerless, he prays. And then, though dying, he saves. With arms outstretched, his death defeats the Philistines so that the Lord's people would be delivered into freedom. It looks so weak. The Philistines think that they are toying about with a little wonky donkey. Little do they know, the Lord can use that little wonky donkey to defeat Dagon. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. He can defeat Dagon with a wonky donkey. He can make a public spectacle of Satan, sin, and shame by triumphing over them by a cursed cross. Now, what does that mean? What's the take home for the first listeners and for us listening? Here's the take home. Your story does not need to end in shame. But if there's going to be a different ending, it does mean that the next chapter in your story, today's chapter of your story, needs to begin with weakness. I think I tend to think that my strength is an asset. Actually, my strength is what makes me an ass. And if I'm going to avoid becoming this donkey, I need to stop trying to ride into situations on a white stallion. We need to begin in weakness. And for you, that might mean putting up your hands this morning and going, and admitting, I have been a donkey. And acknowledging, I ought to end my life like this donkey. And so actually, in weakness, accepting the help that comes from the deliverer who rode on a donkey. And maybe today, right now, is the moment you need to stop, pause, and confess to God and say, I have been so arrogant. I've been so adulterous. And so I've made so many wrong assumptions. See, it's worth asking, end of your life, what will the how things ended picture look like? If there's any sprouts of hope today, then it will begin with humility. And you know what? It took God to take Samson's eyes for him to begin to see clearly. It took God to take Samson's strength in order for him to start to pray properly. It actually took Samson to die before he started serving the Lord as he should have. I wonder what it would take for the Lord to empty us of those arrogant, adulterous assumptions and get us to the point where he can say, I can work with that. And if the hair is going to begin to grow again in our lives, then I think what we learn from this story is that happy endings that avoid humiliation begin and end with humility. That actually weakness is strength, and sometimes defeat is victory.